Hello, everybody. Welcome to our little webinar series. It's good to see you, sort of see you, be seen by you. So today we're going to sort of dig into dementia. Alzheimer's gets a lot of the attention, but it's only one kind of dementia, and there's a lot of overlap among them. We'll talk about that. So your reminder, guys, those of you who are new, this is just meant to be, these slides are meant to just kind of get some basic level setting and prompt us to think and talk. The real action, I think, is in the Q&A and discussion. So don't be shy. This is meant to be a safe place. You don't have to do anything and just listen, but if you do have a question, if you're up for sharing a comment or your own experience, that is nothing but welcome. We just love that. I think this way we can all learn from each other. I certainly don't know everything there is to this subject by a mile, so I'm sure a lot of you guys on the call know all sorts of things that I don't. So please share. And it's meant to be safe. Nothing, no ridicule here. There's no shame. This is a private session to some degree, and it's open to anybody, but this is meant to be a safe place to say and think just about anything. So let's cut over to Sonia real quick.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, especially before a long weekend. We really appreciate it. So I just wanted to let everyone know the two ways that you can ask questions or interact with us after BJ's gone through his slides. If you would like to ask your question out loud, you can click the little raise hand button and we will unmute you, and you can unmute yourself on your end and ask the question out loud. Or if you would prefer to not do that or want to remain anonymous, you can type your question into the question area further down below, and one of us will read that out. Again, per BJ's note, this is meant to be, a place where you feel safe. So if you do not want us to mention your name, please just let us know and we will absolutely respect that, no problem. So again, you can raise your hand and ask a question out loud, or you can type it in and we will read it out and answer it for you. And a quick final note, sometimes we are not able to get to all the questions in the hour-long session. So if that is the case, please know that we will record a second recording to address those questions and post that as well. Thanks again for being here.
All righty. Thank you, Sonia. Okay, guys, so as I mentioned, there are many types of dementia. Alzheimer's being the sort of most described or most discussed. But there is also dementia that is fallout from vascular disease, from strokes or just sclerosing of the blood vessels, low blood flow over time can cause changes in the brain that evince dementia. Lewy body disease is a particular form of dementia. And some of these have motor issues as well, not just memory issues. I think dementia we generally associate with memory loss, but it's not just memory, as we'll talk. Personality changes, sort of executive functioning, the mind's ability to kind of control one's daily life and regulate one's functions, et cetera, over time begins to come apart, really. And some of these have also motor findings, is what I was trying to say. Lewy body does. Parkinson's disease does as well. Note, this may present in all sorts of ways. So Parkinson's, for example, may be wholly motor for most people, many people, I should say. And dementia may be a much less of an issue or not at all. Frontotemporal lobe dementia, FTD, is a particularly difficult one in some ways. It can be much more rapid. Most dementias play out over years. FTD can be a little quicker and a little more jarring. Sometimes, given the part of the brain that's involved, you get some, loss of inhibition. So people can get sort of angry or hypersexual or just personality changes. It can be very difficult to manage and very difficult to see and very uncharacteristic for the person suffering from FTD. Huntington's disease, rare genetic disease, but profound, lots of motor symptoms, personality changes, memory issues. CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, associated similar to years ago, you may have heard about mad cow, prion disease. This one too can be more rapid in decline. And then chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. This is the one we've heard a lot about from contact sports, namely football, in recent years. And this is just repeated trauma to the brain over time. Okay, so all of these can be causes of dementia, so it isn't just about Alzheimer's. Oop, what did I do? Sorry. So one of the things about dementia is, like I said here, some of them are faster than others, and some, start imperceptibly. And oftentimes people early in the course of disease, like especially something like Alzheimer's or vascular dementias, can be aware of the dementia. At some point, the person generally loses insight into their situation. But early on in the disease trajectory, people may very well know that their mind's not working very well. They're forgetting things, can't remember what happened 5 minutes ago, etc. In general, with dementias, older memories are preserved the longest. So they're sort of more deeply set into the brain. And so therefore, they take longer to get at, in a sense. So most often, the memory starts in sort of short-term memory loss. And here too, especially with something like Alzheimer's, which is really only diagnosable officially on autopsy. It's coming around, but it's hard to test for Alzheimer's. It's more of a kind of a clinical picture that you put together. But it can be hard, as with a lot of chronic illnesses, to discern what's sort of just normal aging. I mean, forgetfulness from stress, from all sorts of things, from just being older, and that's just common. That's normal. Where we tip over into what would be considered, sort of from a medical lens, pathological or a disease state, can be subtle at first, at least. The big thing to note, even though there's discrepancies among the dementias time-wise, is it tends to be a long arc. I think the average with Alzheimer's may be 5 to 7 years. I can't recall, something like that, oftentimes longer, which has implications for everybody involved, including the caregiver. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon, as they say. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So caregiving, a lot of the needs early on are kind of commonsensical, helping the person remember by, medications, like getting a pill box so the person doesn't have to remember every time they're supposed to take a pill, writing things down, sort of the basics of reminders in a way. Over time, the watchfulness needs to be more vigilant. People can roam, get up in the middle of the night, walk out of the house. It's not uncommon for people to wander and to go missing for some time. It can be terrifying for everybody involved. So things like bed alarms, or making sure that there's someone is with the person through the night. Also things like, just it can kind of go with frailty in general. So safeguarding the home, having good lighting around, watching the carpet edges, because when someone's not thinking clearly, they're not. It affects how they manage their body too. So falls become much more problematic and they happen more frequently. People may need to be reminded to eat, etc. So early on, it's sort of in that vein, but over time, more profound, more vigilance. And also at some point, depending on the dementia, or depending on the state or the stage of the dementia, activities of daily living, things we've talked about in our caregiving webinars, become really important. So ADLs, toileting, bathing, continence, eating, grooming, these sort of basic functions of physical daily life. Increasingly, someone will need help with those. grooming, eating, etc. So it ranges from sort of memory stuff to and practical support to real vigilance for safety purposes and looking out for the person, being a person's eyes, being a person's mind on some level. And all this happens over time at some pace or another. Another thing that's difficult or can be tricky with caregiving here is sometimes the changes are imperceptible, and between sort of being with each other so much of the time, it can be hard to notice some of these changes. Throw in our propensity sort of to deny issues too, and sometimes you might need, as a caregiver or as a spouse, it may be very helpful to have outside eyes in the situation every once in a while to sort of check where you are. More frequent or routine follow-ups with a neurologist, ideally, or a primary care doc to check in and sort of have some objective lens on the situation, or even just other family members and friends who are not there every day can point out, can see things that you might miss if you're there all day, every day. Trick here too is, and we'll circle back to this a little bit more at the end, but it's not just caregiving in the setting of dementia pulls on you in so many ways. Actually, let me say that there's a slide coming up about that. So in particular with dementia, caregiving becomes its own sort of, there are risks involved to the caregiver. So the stats can be pretty jarring. So, over half of caregivers for people with dementia for more than 4 years. So, long time. And the caregivers in the setting of dementia are greater risk for depression, anxiety, poorer quality of life, even physical problems, heart disease, etc. So it can actually be dangerous to your health. So not to scare you, but the point here is, as a caregiver, you really need to find a way to prioritize your own well-being in this mix. And that may just sound impossible on some level with so much that you need to do to be the caregiver. And yet you just need to find a way. And so that often means getting more help if and when possible. And then it's also expensive. A third of people's wealth can go into dementia care. A reminder that in this country, the single biggest cause of personal bankruptcy is our medical costs, healthcare related costs. So in dementia, given the profundity of needs and the long period of time involved, it can get very expensive. And eventually, oftentimes people, generally the ideal is to live at home. At least we say that, but very often that's just not practical at some point, and not even really desired at some point, especially in the more advanced stages of dementia where the person isn't so aware of their surroundings. It may be just fine for them once they move into a home, a nursing home or dementia ward or unit. It can be jarring at first, foreign territory, but eventually that person often settles in and can be just as happy, if not happier, in that setting as they were at home. That's not always the case, but it's often enough the case. It can be a gut-wrenching decision to make, but often one that comes with a great deal of relief. So advanced directives get a little tricky in the setting of dementia, and there are dementia-specific advanced directives, and we'll include a link in our resources to those. But because in advanced directives, like we've talked on some of these webinars, you are meant, by filling out your advanced directive, you're putting yourself in a sort of a future state and making decisions in advance so that you would want some kinds of care to sustain your life in ways that are meaningful to you. So when dementia is involved, because the memory loss and the personality changes and the quality of life diminishment and the lack of awareness, you may, when you're thinking clearly, you may have very clear ideas about what kind of care you might want. When it comes down the road, when the advanced care directive kicks in, when the person's no longer able to speak for themselves, well, then the advanced directive kicks in, and at that point, the person may be in a very different situation than they imagined they would be, and might seem to want different things. So it gets extra tricky thinking through an advanced directive for dementia, but it is possible, and I would encourage you to do so. Stating your wishes while you can state your wishes is all the more important in advance of dementia. Mhm. So, um, you know, even while I'm listening to my own words here, you know, it's hard to not sound kind of grave when thinking about dementia. And it's not uncommon that a lot of us, especially people who prize their mind, uh, think of dementia as, in a sense, like the worst possible thing. You know, if I can't think, if I can't read, if I can't write, if I can't recognize this or that, then I just, please, you know. So we may say that when, you know, this is again, the advanced part is tricky. The projections are tricky. From here, relying on our minds as we do, it may sound just outrageous, impossible to live without our thinking selves as we know them. And it's not uncommon that people with dementia, never to make that sound easy, but sometimes people with dementia seem to be fine in a sense. You know, they are in the moment. That is a state that people work very hard to achieve with meditation and other ways of actually being present in the moment. And with dementia, losing your sense of the past and losing your ability to project yourself in the future does put you in the moment. So we have to be careful how we project, as ever with illness. When we're healthy or well, what we project onto someone who is sick or living with a disability or at the end of life, et cetera. The projections are really, really tricky and oftentimes more severe than the situation ends up being. So it's, you know, I hear myself talking on both sides of my mouth here, that this is very rough. And on the other hand, be careful of how much roughness you project on the situation. You just have to stay in the moment with the person. I'm now talking to you as a caregiver, staying in the moment with the person. This can often mean like aesthetic pleasures, sensory pleasures can take over. Music can be profound for people and also jog old memories. You know, so just tending to the sort of set and setting, the sensations of the moment can go a long way to easing the situation for both parties. And relationships continue to be possible. They change. So again, I don't want to make this sound easy, but I also don't make it sound too hard. A lot of it is sort of preparing, a lot of the sort of preparation for dementia is getting yourself into a mode of not pretending to think through every little thing that's going to happen. Rather, get into sort of mode of being present, staying in touch with yourself in the moment, just letting things happen and see how you feel in real time. All this is very difficult, but sometimes it's not as difficult as we imagine. So, you know, this can be just what the sort of most heartbreaking. It's one thing, the sort of exhaustion of the physical support, but especially in a loving relationship, when two people care about each other, or family cares about each other, what happens in the later stages of dementia, the person no longer being able to recognize their loved ones, can be just gut wrenching. You know, there's just no two ways about it. And the things that used to bind people together, the personality quirks, the interests, the memories, the dynamic, with those in the state of dissolve, well, you know, even with the person sitting right in front of you, the relationship shifts. Here too, um, you know, maybe this phrase isn't quite right. I think it's probably more useful to imagine that the relationship changes. And this is what I meant, sort of this agility of moving with someone over time and allowing their relationship to change. Mourning the loss, absolutely. I don't pretend this isn't a loss, it's a gain. No, but there may always or may continue to be until deep into the throes of dementia some way to interrelate, even through, like I said, the aesthetic, the sort of sensory modalities. So I would say maybe it's best to think of how these relationships change over time versus altogether lost. Like you either have the person or you don't. There's a zillion shades of gray to surf in between. Again, can be heart-wrenching and incredibly difficult for both parties, of course. Yes, yes, yes. And there can be some surprising moments of beauty and new relationships. Sometimes it's, you know, it's not rare that someone who was very gruff or rough in their personality when they were quote unquote well in the stages of dementia oftentimes go to a much more pleasant state. So sometimes people become nicer, in some ways easier to be around. And it goes the other way too. Some people are just the sweetest thing on the planet, thanks to dementia, can get very moody, irrational, angry, what's the word when you swear a lot? um, Not gruff. Anyway, the changes can go in all directions, but they're not always necessarily down. Sometimes there's some sweetness that comes out, some basic, real loving kindness that comes out, this sort of moment by moment sweetness. So I think that is, yep. Okay, so that's our last slide. Now maybe we can get into the fun stuff, guys. Let me pull off the slides. Okay.
And we do have some questions that have already come in, so I will just start with one of those. So this person says, I have a friend who had her seemingly first psychotic episode at age 65, and there is some question if it is Alzheimer's. Now, a psychiatrist is saying it's schizophrenia. Is there a connection between schizophrenia and Alzheimer's in older adults?
Not that I'm aware of. Those are very different mechanisms, very different disease processes. So not that I'm aware of. Some dementias can have psychotic features. I mean, FTD, this sort of loss of inhibition, mix that with disorientation and fear, and people are capable of all sorts of behavior. So not knowing the details is hard. I certainly can't diagnose from here. But in answer to the strict answer to your question, I am not aware of a connection between schizophrenia and Alzheimer's altogether. I would imagine this person would really, really benefit from a visit with a neurologist. There are all sorts of testing that can be done, neuropsychiatric testing, family history, et cetera, that can be done to sleuth this out. The brain, as we know, is, wow, is it complicated piece of real estate. So it can take a while to sleuth these out, especially because some of them don't have a clear diagnostic, like a blood test, for example. But if I were this person, I would get to a neurologist. A psychiatrist can be very helpful in terms of coping and managing, but in terms of diagnosing, I'd really push you to get to a neurologist.
Okay, our next question is two parts. This person said, I'm very keen to gauge the distinctions between normal and a condition around short-term memory behaviors. Also, if someone is showing early signs but is resistant to seeing a doctor, is there an extensive planning outline that they can prepare to alleviate burden of family?
So let's see here. The advanced directive for dementia, it'd be certainly a place to start. Those tools are pretty, they're not in fine details necessarily. You can add fine details, person preferences, and we encourage people to do that. Sort of caregiving preferences, who they want around, what kind of music or food, etc. Willingness to have professionals involved, like home health aides, for example, if they want to be at home. So one tool would be this advanced directive specifically for dementia, and that will get you in the ballpark. And then you can add details from there. That would be definitely a place to point you. Again, the gradations between sort of normal aging or stress-related short-term memory loss and Alzheimer's or any of the other dementias need to be witnessed over time. It would be very hard in the early stages of dementia to have sort of one single visit, one point of data to know what's going on here. You really need to see changes over time. So if I heard the first part of the question correctly, there's some resistance in this person to getting medical attention. Was that right, Sonia?
The first part was just trying to figure out what the difference is between, normal aging memory and something that might be a more serious condition like dementia.
Yeah. Well, early on, it might be hard to tell. And still a trip to the neurologist can be very, very helpful. Neuropsychiatric testing can be super exquisitely helpful, teasing these things out. So I would definitely still push you to be for some testing, even early on. But in general, you know, the memory loss, short-term memory loss of stress or aging, it's not going to, there's generally not a sort of stepwise progression. It sort of may come and go depending on how busy the day is. The person is very likely to have insight into that memory loss. If it's not a pathological state, you know, sort of a normal aging, the person themselves will likely be aware that they're, you know, they forgot this or that. So on some degree, it's just sort of shades of gray of insight that the person may have, and then also the progression over time. And especially if there are personality changes associated with that memory loss, irritability, irrationality. It's just not thinking clearly, not stringing together, not reasoning through things well. That's different from memory loss per se. Like, where did I put my keys is different from what's a key again? You know, that kind of thing. So yeah, personality changes, other physical elements of decline, if the person's falling a lot or has a tremor or has changes in their gait or muscle function. You know, these kinds of things can be telltale signs that there's something beyond sort of normal aging happening. But when in doubt, this is where, again, the testing can be very, very helpful. I hope that answers the question. Come on back to me if it doesn't, please.
Okay, next up. Next up is someone who works as a death doula, and she is working with a person whose loved one has posterior cortex atrophy. Anything you can shed on PCA would be helpful.
You know, I don't know about posterior cortex atrophy. I wonder, are you able to tell us any of the symptoms that this person is demonstrating?
Might have to wait a bit. This one was written
sorry. So, you know, we can look this one up. I am not immediately familiar with it. So we can look this up. So let us get back to you. Maybe we can circle back on our questions afterwards. Give me a minute to look it up. But if you have any insights as a doula or as a person, just please come on back and share what you're seeing, what you're witnessing. Maybe we can piece something together.
Okay, great. This next question is, my mother is in hospice in a nursing home with late stage Alzheimer's. She is 90 and about 100 pounds. Hospice says elderly dementia can linger for a long time. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, so it can linger for a long time. I mean, this can go on for years. And again, there's so many gradations. It's one of the stunning things you realize in situations like this is just how much there is to lose in terms of a person's functioning. It is kind of remarkable. Reverse engineering kind of makes a point of how remarkable human beings are, how complex we are. And sometimes you only get inside of that as you sort of slowly lose things, lose function, lose memory, lose capacity over time. It can be stunning, and it can take a long, long time. Your comment about your mom being 100 pounds, you know, that is so one of the things to appreciate about dementias, as I said earlier, is it's not just memory, not by a long shot, especially in the later stages. It's this ability, the body's ability to sort of orchestrate itself, to read signals, to read reflexes, to eat, for example. And one of the most agonizing, I'm really glad for your question, because one of the most difficult things oftentimes for families is when the person stops eating. This is just such an emotionally charged issue. Food, nutrition, nourishment, there's all these emotional layers to eat together, and food has so many so many roles for us. So in watching a loved one sort of fade away in so many ways, including bodily, can be really, really difficult. It's, you know, one of the tricky things here is So that may lead one to wanting for artificial nutrition, to place a feeding tube, for example, into the stomach or through the nose. And that is generally, in the setting of dementia, generally not a good idea. Generally speaking, not a good idea. Feeding tubes are good bridges if you've got some obstruction or something interfering with food getting down into the stomach or into the gut. That's when a feeding tube can be particularly helpful over time, or in a temporary process that's going to get better. With dementia, we know it's not going to get better. One of the things I should have said earlier is dementia is a terminal illness. All those types of dementias are technically a terminal disease. They will end in death. So that is a really important piece of the puzzle. It may be a very slow death, and it may be manageable for a long time, but it will take one's life eventually. And one of the ways it does that is it just interferes with our body's ability to function in these other ways, to take in food, for example. And even if you place food into someone with dementia through a feeding tube, the data is pretty clear that it does not prolong their survival. So that weight loss you're witnessing is most likely, unless there's somewhere they're living is a place is neglectful or something else, I highly doubt it. But that weight loss that you're witnessing is a symptom of the disease. It's not the problem in of itself. So be leery of any rush to force nutrition into your mother. There's oftentimes a long period of time where the person, when prompted or when cued, when offered food, will take it. They may not be able to say, "I'm hungry, please feed me. Where's dinner?" But if offered food, they may very well go for it. So the way to proceed here, generally speaking, is to offer food, but to not force it. And oftentimes, also professional caregivers do this too. Sometimes really start pushing the food into the person's mouth, not just to help them, but actually kind of force it. There's also a reflex. If you scratch the cheek here, it's a suckling reflex from infancy that can be present in late stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. So sometimes stimulating the cheek will just reflexively get the person to eat. That at some point, that's also kind of forcing the issue. So it may be agonizing, but sometimes it's very often a symptom to respect. It just tells us that the end is coming, the end is near. So encouraging food, but not forcing it as a rule. We can talk more about that detail if you'd like. The other thing to think through here would be what your mom's wishes would be, or your wishes for your mom's care. A really important question here, knowing that dementia is a terminal disease that can't be fixed. Very often people that I work with will adopt not a hastening someone's death, certainly not trying to bring about death, but getting out of the way of death is very different. So a merciful way that your mom's life may close may be something like a pneumonia, an infection. That is often at some point a simple, merciful way to go. At some point, if you go back and forth from the hospital and keep rescuing the person, we end up selecting out for more and more difficult, spectacular ways of dying. So I don't pretend to know your situation, and I don't want to tell you what to do here at all, but just to offer up some thoughts about how to bring a life to a close, how to allow death to come into the picture with a minimum of pain and distress. Going to and from the hospital for someone in the throes of dementia can be terrifying. They don't know where they are, bells and whistles, foreign sounds. It can be really, really traumatic. So it's not something to do lightly. So anyway, I'm sort of going on here and using what I imagine some questions happening for you to talk about things more broadly. Forgive me if these are at all no way relevant to your situation there, but also please come back with any follow-up. And also anyone else who wants to weigh in across, other participants in the webinar, please do chime in. A lot of you guys may have experience with any of these situations.
And we did get some more information about PCA from the person who originally asked. Apparently it's a visual variant of Alzheimer's and is very rare. It's also called Benson's disease. It affects the areas in the back of the brain responsible for spatial perception, complex visual processing, spelling, and calculation. This comes along with Alzheimer's and is usually diagnosed early in life relative to other dementias. This person in question was diagnosed at 56, and basically these people go blind at the same time as their dementia progresses.
Hmm. Yeah, so Alzheimer's, there are genetic versions and variants, and some early onset Alzheimer's, and something like you're describing affect a specific part of the brain, in this case, the spatial functioning. So my guess would be, given that early onset, the dementias tend to be a little bit more aggressive. My guess is this has a shorter prognosis. I don't know that, but that would be my guess. And otherwise, from where I sit in my sort of generalist hat, I think a lot of the rest of it is sort of commonsensical insofar as like imagining someone losing their memory, losing their ability to think clearly, and losing their sight. Vision is such an important way we orient ourselves, and we know the world, and we know ourselves in the world. For most of us, a sight is a profound part of that. And so this person is certainly is behind several 8 balls in a way that is just going to be extra hard for that person to orient themselves, extra hard for them to physically navigate the planet. So fall risks go way up. Disorientation and fear probably go way up. And my guess is this is a shorter prognosis. So as with all dementias, if this person is early enough in their course, to be able to kind of be aware of what's happening to them, then you want to front load a lot of the relational work. Certainly thinking about what kind of care that if the person's able to say for themselves what kind of care they're looking for, where they want to be, who they would like to be with, etc. But also reviewing a person's life, thinking through sharing memories while they still have them. In other words, delighting in the person in front of you while that person is really intact, and to the degree that they are. So visits from friends and family, anyone who might want to have to some final thoughts and final memories would be extra important to do sooner than later. True of all dementias, but probably my guess is extra true in PCA.
And we do have a quick follow-up from the person who wrote in about her mom who's living with dementia in the nursing home. It sounds like she is only eating if she takes it, but they keep treating her UTIs. And I was hoping that we could stop getting in the way of her dying, as she is completely dependent on all ADLs and has no memory of her life. Is it wrong to ask them to quit treating her UTIs?
Not at all. It's not at all wrong. It is absolutely ethical to not treat. You can always say no to treatment ethically, legally. Now, sometimes some caregivers may have their own religious views or moral views on that, and it's not uncommon that I've heard some really difficult stories where families are very clear, as you sound to be, and the professional caregivers have a different idea of what's moral and etc. So it can be very, very tricky, but legally, and in the U.S. Western bioethics, you are absolutely within your rights to not treat anything, including a UTI. And as you say, I think from hearing you correctly, and from my own experience, I think what you're talking about doing is sort of is a blessing, is a merciful way to go. Again, death will come, so it's a matter of how. And so stopping treating simple things like UTIs or other infections can be a way to get out of the way of death and to allow this person's life to come to a close in a relatively painless fashion. So you might also make the argument, especially with UTIs, that there may be discomfort associated with that. You might want to treat a UTI because it's relatively easy to treat and because it can be uncomfortable. And it can be a hard infection because a person can harbor UTI for a long, long time before it breaks into the bloodstream and the person gets septic and passes away. So it's a judgment call here, but to answer your question, you're absolutely within your rights as a family. If you're the healthcare proxy, to state emphatically to the care home, wherever this person is, that no, you do not want any treatment. The only treatment you want is for her comfort. that it's absolutely, you're right, and generally a pretty good way to go from where I sit.
Okay. Our next question is, do you have a take on the recent FDA approval of the Alzheimer's drug or other possible forthcoming therapies?
You know, I only know about that situation from the news myself. I haven't dug into it. It did seem, from at least the sort of headlines, that it was unusually put through the process unusually quickly, without the generally longer timeline of testing. I don't know the particulars of why that's the case, or even if it was the case, that may have just been the media doing media stuff. I don't really know. You know, the last time I checked with my namesake, Bruce Miller at UCSF, the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. It's a wonderful place, by the way. I can't say enough about him. You know, real quick tangent. A good dementia neurology clinic will have neurologists, yes, but also social workers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, perhaps speech pathologists, a real team, an array of people, because again, it's not just the thinking that's going awry here, and because there's need for so much sort of wraparound support. So the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF is such a place. They do incredible work, psychologists, psychiatrists, et cetera. Because you can imagine depression is a very common overlay. It can be very depressing to sense oneself, losing oneself. So keeping an eye out for depression and treating that where appropriate is important. Anyway, how did I get off on that? Oh, when I last talked with Bruce Miller, who's, you know, the top of his field, you know, we were talking once, and this had been about maybe 3 years ago, and you can bet he's on the lookout for treatments of any kind. And he said to me, really, the only thing we really know works is exercise, and over time, keep the blood flowing. Basics of nutrition, et cetera. But really, in terms of wanting to stave off memory loss and dementias to the degree possible, is often comes down to exercise. And even once diagnosed with dementia, exercise can help slow the process, because what you're doing is you're moving blood flow and you're moving oxygen, and that seems really, really critical to preserving neural function. So that was a couple of years ago. Now things may have changed since he made that statement, and Lord knows a lot is being tested. The incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's are going up and up and up, and many of us are going to die, and if not from a dementia, at least with a dementia. That's just going to become increasingly common as we get older and older, and we live longer. We will unveil things like dementias eventually. So that's as much as I can say here, though. That's the extent of my knowledge.
Just a quick note, someone wrote in about the woman's mother who is living with dementia in the nursing home, and about the UTI, and she just wrote in and said this is something that they did with her grandmother, who had a foot infection and the progression of gangrene and sepsis, and the option was to amputate at age 91 during the final stages of Alzheimer's. So this person had some success with asking for no treatment.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I wonder if a person's willing to say how difficult or easy was that decision to make.
As far as the question of easy to make, please let us know. I did ask if it was, if there was pushback on that from the professional caregivers, and they said there wasn't, which is great to hear. We do have a hand up. Rebecca, I can unmute you here, and you will need to unmute yourself on your end. She said it was painful for the family, but there was no pushback from the clinical group. Yeah. Understandable.
None of these things is easy, of course, and you're often choosing between really hard decision A and even harder decision B, and it's very relative, but it does sound like, all things considered, knowing how these things can play out, that you made a very good decision. And I'm glad to hear the medical community was supportive.
Yeah. Rebecca, are you able to unmute yourself?
I did unmute.
Oh, there you go. You were just waiting politely. Perfect.
So I have a couple of things to share, and one is that BJ, you talk about remaining in the moment with your your loved one who is experiencing dementia.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one caregiver to my mother who I lost to dementia 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what I learned in the process, and it wasn't so easy for others to take this on, but I learned how vital it was to embrace rather than resist what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it made living with my mother's dementia and her disillusion so much easier. It wasn't easy. Obviously, it wasn't easy.
Right.
But I didn't spend my time pushing her, challenging her, feeding her when it wasn't what she wanted and it wasn't fair for her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one piece of advice I have for people going through this is just meet them where they are
Mm-hmm.
in that moment, on that day. That's I think just the biggest slice of grace that you can give your loved one.
Amen, Rebecca. How did you come to have that insight? How did you figure that out?
You know, I don't know how I figured it out. I think it just well, you know what? I had gone through personal coaching and I think that helped me a lot. And I just watched my sisters and I watched my stepfather interact with my mom in a very different manner, and they just got frustrated, and my mother would get frustrated, and I just felt like there had to be another way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so much easier to just embrace what was happening and embrace the process. And it's like the women sharing or the people sharing about their mother's experience. You want to prolong their life because you don't want to lose them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to prolong their life because it's a shitty way to live.
Yeah.
And so not treating the UTI and not doing things that would further their days on earth, in my mind, is the right decision because you're just letting them go gracefully.
Yeah.
As gracefully as it is possible.
Yeah. I really appreciate your comments, Rebecca. It's such good advice. I wonder, I don't ever want to be Pollyannish about this place, but I wonder if that experience taught you a lot about your own life. I mean, I think there's something so wise about what you're saying in terms of moving with reality rather than trying to fix it and hold on to it the way it was a day or a month or a year ago, but rather to continue to move through life and move through reality as as an ever-changing dynamic. It's hard to do, but it certainly is one of those can be one of those sort of major lessons that can come about through tending to illness, what your own or somebody else's, when things are happening that you wouldn't want to happen, but that's sort of the power of life. Things are outside of our control, much of it, if not all of it. And our task is to move with it rather than to cling to it. And you're also pointing out the profound sort of self-awareness that goes with your approach of being able to tell when you're projecting onto somebody your wishes for them versus what they might need or want. That's another really, really key thing that you're describing that you did, and it can be very hard to do. It's something that comes also with attunement and time and becoming more and more self-aware. So some really key sort of life lessons that you're describing in there, and I'm sure that made a big difference for your mom's care. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. Again, I'm with you. It's nothing easy about that, but there's certainly a grace that comes with that approach. So thank you so much. Yeah. Anything else you want to share there, Rebecca?
Yeah, I do believe it made a difference, and it has very much informed how I've dealt with things that have happened since her passing, personal things. So thank you for noting that. And if I may, the other thing I just wanted to address is the approval of this drug, because it just so happens that my husband and I hosted an event the other night for the Alzheimer's Association. And the number 2 woman in the national office, from the national office, who is in charge of strategy, came here to El Paso to address this group of people that we had put together. And it was just done because the association really feels like they need to develop and cultivate a donor base, and just to let people know what services they provide. And obviously this physician addressed the topic of the drug that the FDA approved. And someone asked, why did the Alzheimer's Association advocate for approval of this drug when there was so much controversy surrounding it? And Dr. Pike said, this is not the drug that is going to cure Alzheimer's, but the minute you approve something that gives some people hope, private forces will enter the fray and pour a lot of money and resources into trying to come up with the next great thing. And that may not be the cure either, but the third great thing may be. So it just, it really serves to foster this growth and inspiration and motivation for people to do bigger and better things, which makes a lot of sense, because I was kind of questioning how that whole thing went through with so much toxicity, really.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight too. Yeah, that helps me understand the process. I mean, obviously these are risks and rewards, and everything needs to be carefully sort of, balanced in a way. But you're pointing something really important, this idea, especially with how resources flow. There's got to be some, if the research community is just sort of giving up, just saying, look, we tried, we can't find it, they'll just move on. And then there are a lot of diseases that out there that just don't have any resources. No one's studying them, and that's ends up being feels very sad, and it can register, seems like almost like that no one cares. And your point about sort of protecting and preserving hope where it's reasonable, where it's realistic, and this idea that research progresses in an incremental way. We should never make the case. We should never talk about a drug as a magic cure-all. It's just almost, I don't remember one that's ever been a cure-all, and this is how science proceeds, and this is how science advances. And it's not just what's happening in the laboratory. There has to be a public demand for it. There has to be money for it. And that requires inspiration and hope and a sense of something being possible. So anyway, I really appreciate your comments there, and it helps me understand a little bit of why this drug got approved. I'm assuming that the basics of safety were checked off enough to warrant this sort of incremental approach. So thank you. Anything else, Rebecca? One more question out there.
Yeah, I think we've got one more hand. Melissa, I'm going to unmute you. Let's see if we can get to one final question here. Melissa, you may need to unmute yourself on your end.
Hey, BJ, it's Ma, also known as Melissa.
Hello, Melissa.
How you doing? I really must commend Rebecca's honest and forthright observation on the aducanumab and future monoclonal drugs, because as someone affiliated with the Alzheimer's Association, right, it's not the end all be all. We just got to start somewhere. And our AAIC conference, there are so many great researchers and then practitioners like yourself. We are just striving, all of us. And as a person who lost her grandmother, again, the comments about, UTIs / something, that would be so invasive as an amputation for someone in the final stages of Alzheimer's. We don't want that for ourselves or for future generations. So thank you so much for what you're doing, BJ. And again, Rebecca, great, frank, candid, honest thoughts, because that's where we're all at. We're just doing the best we can during the pandemic. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you, Ma. That's beautiful. Thank you. And wow, that might be just the perfect timing here, guys. Any more questions as we come to the close of our hour?
I think we've got one here, but I want to make sure to give it attention. So let's just, we can address that one outside of the hour. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we give this question the time it deserves. So thanks everyone for being here, again, especially before a long weekend. And just a quick reminder, FYI, if you are experiencing any kind of situation personally, or someone else's, we are here to help with these things, and we have complimentary 20-minute sessions if you ever want to reach out and just check in with us and see if we might be able to help you or someone you're caring for. That's the whole reason we started Mettle. So that's just a quick plug for what we do. And this is a question that we're trying to ask these questions at the end of our discussions is, what kind of support do you feel is most needed, or what kind of resources would you want to help, either as a caregiver or as someone living with dementia? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Till next time.